The ink on the treaty was barely dry, yet the air inside the cabin felt heavy, pressurized by a silence that refused to break. Ruby sat fixed in her seat, her fingers locked deep into the armrest. Her knuckles were white, the skin pulled tight against the bone, mirroring the fragility of the agreement they had just signed. Outside, the sky was an endless, indifferent blue, but the jet vibrated with a rhythm that felt wrong. It was a jagged, inconsistent pulse beneath her feet. She looked down at the documents resting on her lap, the paper crisp and sharp, representing a piece that felt more like a countdown. Every minor dip in the turbulence sent a tremor through the floorboards, and she shifted her weight, trying to find a stability that simply did not exist. The engines hummed, a low, mechanical drone that failed to mask the tension tightening in her chest. She watched the cabin walls, waiting for the slightest sign of instability. The treaty was a promise, but the altitude was a reminder of how quickly a descent could begin. She kept her grip firm, refusing to let go, knowing that the thin metal shell around them was the only thing standing between them and the reality of a broken promise. Across the narrow aisle, Elwyn did not look at the documents. He stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the shifting wall of clouds. His right hand moved instinctively to his left forearm, fingers tracing the path of a jagged, raised ridge of skin. He pressed down, the skin whitening under the pressure of his touch. It was a map of a previous, failed negotiation. He felt the phantom heat of that day every time he looked at the sky. His thumb circled the center of the scar, a rhythmic, unconscious motion that betrayed the calm expression on his face. The jet hit a pocket of thin air, dropping sharply. Elwyn did not reach for the armrest. He kept his hand on his arm, his grip tightening as the metal chassis groaned under the strain of the altitude. He knew that sensation. It was the sound of a predator testing the perimeter. He looked away from the clouds and focused on the bulkhead, his jaw set. The past was not behind them. It was simply waiting for the right moment to catch up. He felt the air pressure shift again, a sudden, sharp drop that popped his ears. He inhaled, his eyes scanning the horizon for the shadow he knew was coming. Jacqueline shifted in the seat, ignoring the rhythmic vibration of the fuselage. She pulled a carry bag closer, snapping the buckles open with practiced efficiency. She checked the contents, her fingers running over the smooth surface of her equipment, confirming everything was in place. She did not look at the clouds or the horizon. She looked at her wrist. Her thumb pressed the side of the timepiece, the display glowing with a soft, pulsing light. 3 hours. The match was 3 hours away. She adjusted the straps of her gear, tightening them until they held firm against her frame. There was no room for error in the arena, and she treated the preparation with the same intensity she applied to her training. She checked the time again, tapping the glass face of the watch to ensure the seconds were still ticking forward. Her focus narrowed until the entire world became nothing but the upcoming match. She leaned back, eyes scanning the small items laid out before her, checking for any sign of wear or damage. She wanted no surprises when she stepped onto the court. The jet hummed, but she heard only the steady, internal countdown of her own ambition. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, visualizing the first strike before opening them to check the watch one final time. The jet maintained its course, a silver needle threading through the jagged mountain peaks. At this altitude, the air was thin, barely enough to sustain the engines, which hummed with a monotonous, rhythmic drone. Outside, the jagged rock faces were close enough to see the deep fissures in the stone, their shadows long and sharp against the snow-covered slopes. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy. The only movement was the occasional flicker of a needle on the console, or the subtle sway of the aircraft as it navigated the invisible currents between the peaks. The mountain range seemed to close in, the massive stone walls rising on both sides to funnel the plane into a narrow corridor of sky. There was no turbulence yet, only the steady forward momentum of the machine. The light within the cabin dimmed as they drifted into the shadow of a towering ridge, casting the rows of seats into a cool, blue-gray. Below them, the world was silent, frozen, and completely unreachable. The hum of the jet was the only sound in the vast, empty space, a steady pulse that masked the stillness of the peaks. Everything was in place. A final moment of quiet before the trajectory of their journey shifted forever. The hum of the engines remained constant, yet the air inside the cabin grew dense. Ruby turned from the window, her gaze sweeping across the small interior. She caught Elwyn watching her. His hand moved away from the scar on his forearm, his fingers curling into a tight fist against his thigh. He looked toward Jacqueline, who had stopped her preparations entirely. For a long, pressurized moment, no one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was laden with the presence of their hidden abilities. Ruby saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes, a shared acknowledgement that they were not just passengers on a standard flight. They were containers of something volatile. Elwyn exhaled, a slow, deliberate sound that broke the stillness. He met Ruby's eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent pact, a confirmation that they were ready if the facade failed. Jacqueline looked down at her hands, her knuckles briefly glowing with a faint, dying ember of energy before she clamped them shut. The bond between them tightened, an invisible web of awareness that rendered the cabin walls irrelevant. They were three strangers to the outside world, but here, in the cold altitude, they were tethered by the secret they all carried. Ruby looked back at the clouds, the weight of their reality pressing down on her chest. Ruby reached into her bag and pulled out the folder containing the treaty. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and smelled faintly of industrial adhesive. She spread it across her lap. The ink was still dark and sharp, the signatures of human delegates and dragon representatives stark against the page. She traced the line where the two borders met, a boundary drawn in legal language that felt flimsy against the reality of their history. Could a few paragraphs of prose truly bridge the gap between their kinds? She pressed her thumb against the seal at the bottom of the document. It was cold. She remembered the debates, the shouting, the long nights spent hammering out terms that both sides viewed as temporary at best. The treaty was a fragile thing, a temporary pause in a conflict that had spanned generations. She looked at the signatures again, trying to find a promise in the loops and curves of the script. There was none, only a set of rules and a deadline for renegotiation. She closed the folder, the snap of the metal ring echoing in the cabin. The piece felt less like a foundation and more like a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. She wondered if anyone else in the cabin believed this truce would last through the week. The rhythmic drone of the jet engines settled into the cabin walls, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Ruby rested her head against the window, watching the blur of white clouds pass by. The atmosphere was thick, saturated with the quiet intensity of three people holding their breath. Jacqueline tapped her fingers against her thigh in a steady, rapid pattern, mirroring the tempo of the engine turbines. Every few seconds, the plane dipped slightly, a minor turbulence that caused the overhead lights to flicker. Elwyn remained motionless in his seat, his gaze fixed on the back of the pilot's headrest. He reached out and adjusted the air vent, the hiss of pressurized oxygen cutting through the mechanical thrum. There was no conversation. The silence was dominated by the mechanical pulse of the aircraft, a steady ticking toward their destination. Ruby watched a drop of condensation slide down the glass, zigzagging as the plane banked hard to the left. The air within the cabin felt recycled and stale, carrying the faint scent of ozone and heated metal. Each passenger was locked in their own private orbit, yet the collective anxiety was a physical presence, pressing against them from all sides. The engines spiked in pitch for a heartbeat, then leveled out, leaving the cabin vibrating in a tense, rhythmic trance. Elwyn turned his head away from the pilot's cabin. He looked past the wing, scanning the vast expanse of the upper atmosphere. The clouds were dense, banked in heavy layers that reflected the pale sun with blinding intensity. He squinted as a flicker caught his eye. It was not the steady glow of the sun off the wing, but a sharp, rhythmic pulse of light. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the corner of the frame. There, suspended against a bank of dark gray vapor, a jagged point of light appeared. It was copper, metallic, and distinctly unnatural. The shimmer rippled as if the air itself were being distorted by intense heat. Elwyn tapped his fingers against the armrest, his movement slowing as he tracked the movement. It moved against the wind, a deliberate glide that defied the erratic updrafts of the mountain range. He wiped the condensation from the window with his palm, his focus sharpening. The shimmer expanded, a flash of reflective scales catching the light before disappearing back into the haze. He did not blink. He watched the void where it had been, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Something was pacing the aircraft, hidden in the glare of the clouds, waiting for the right moment to close the distance. The steady hum of the flight vanished. Without warning, the floor dropped away. The entire fuselage lurched violently to the left, a sickening twist that threw Ruby against the side panel. Her head struck the frame with a dull thud. Across the aisle, Jacqueline was tossed from her seat, her equipment bag sliding across the floor and slamming into the bulkhead with a heavy metallic clang. Elwyn braced his hands against the cabin wall, his feet skidding on the carpet as the gravity shifted. The plane groaned, the metal frame shrieking under the sudden, abnormal stress. Loose items, water bottles, tablets, and personal gear became airborne, clattering against the ceiling before raining back down. Ruby scrambled to regain her footing, but a secondary, sharper jolt forced her to lock her arms against the armrest to keep from being thrown again. The cabin light flickered and died, leaving them in the dim gray glow of the clouds outside. The rhythm of the flight had been shattered. Every surface in the cabin now vibrated with an erratic, uncontrolled shudder. Jacqueline pushed herself up from the floor, her eyes scanning the ceiling, while Elwyn stared at the cockpit door, his knuckles white as he gripped the seat. The aircraft banked at a steep, impossible angle, sliding through the air like a falling stone. The plane tilted further, the angle of the floor making it impossible to stand. Ruby dug her fingers into the upholstery, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Below the screaming of the jet engines, a new frequency emerged. It started as a low-end vibration, a rhythmic hum that bypassed the ears and settled directly into the marrow of their bones. It was not mechanical, it was organic. Elwyn pulled himself toward the center aisle, his eyes wide as he tracked the origin of the sound. It grew, expanding from a rumble into a guttural, terrifying resonance that seemed to vibrate the very rivets of the fuselage. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged with a sudden, oppressive static that made the hair on their arms stand up. Then, the sound peaked. A roar, raw and impossibly loud, tore through the skin of the plane. It drowned out the alarms, the wind, and the desperate groans of the metal frame. The sound was so intense that the plastic panels covering the interior walls began to crack under the pressure. Ruby covered her ears, but the sound cut through, a primal signal of a predator claiming its territory. The aircraft shuddered under the sheer force of the noise, shaking as if it had been struck by a physical blow before the impact even arrived. The roar had not even died away when the impact arrived. A massive, molten copper shape slammed into the port wing with the force of a falling mountain. The entire fuselage groaned, the metal frame buckling inward as if crushed by a giant fist. Sparks showered through the cabin as the connection between the wing and the main body shrieked, the rivets popping one by one like gunfire. The plane shuddered violently, throwing everyone against the starboard wall. Ruby watched in disbelief as the wing spar twisted, the skin of the aircraft tearing open to reveal the freezing sky outside. The sound was deafening, a screech of tortured aluminum that drowned out everything else. The jet tilted sharply, losing all lift on the damaged side, and began to drop toward the peaks. Elwyn reached out, his hand grasping for a hold, but the floor tilted beneath his feet. The cabin grew cold instantly, wind screaming through the breach where the wing had once been flush against the frame. Gravity shifted, pulling the plane into a steep, uncontrollable dive. The copper beast surged past the window, its scales reflecting the dying light of the afternoon, leaving a trail of debris in its wake. The structural integrity was gone. The plane was no longer flying, it was falling. The horizon vanished. The sky became a spinning blur of gray and white as the jet entered a terminal spin. G-forces clamped down on them, turning every limb into lead. Ruby felt the blood drain from her head, her vision tunneling to a pinprick. Every attempt to lift an arm ended in failure. The weight of the descent was absolute. Beside her, Elwyn was pressed deep into his seat, his jaw locked tight against the crushing pressure. The cabin whined as the airframe twisted, struggling against the physics of the fall. Outside the fractured windows, the jagged mountain peaks rose up like obsidian teeth, rushing toward them at terrifying speed. The engine sputtered, silenced by the angle of the drop, leaving only the sound of wind howling through the fuselage. The plane banked hard, throwing the debris inside the cabin into a chaotic dance. They were pinned in place, spectators to their own destruction. Every passing second brought the stone ridges closer, the gray rock filling the entire field of view. The vibration was no longer just the sound of the engine, it was the entire frame of the jet fighting to stay together against the pull of the earth. Gravity had become their jailer, and the mountains were the executioner. The spin slowed for a heartbeat as the jet caught an updraft, providing a momentary release from the crushing weight. Jacqueline seized the gap. She kicked off the armrest, her boots sliding on the debris-strewn floor. She lunged forward, hands outstretched toward the cockpit door. The plane lurched again, a violent lateral shift that sent her sprawling against the bulkhead. She ignored the impact, driving her shoulder into the metal wall to anchor herself. Her fingers curled around the frame of the cockpit door, knuckles raw from the strain. She pulled. The handle groaned, resisting, but she braced her feet against the floor and put every ounce of her strength into the mechanism. The cabin groaned in protest, the internal rivets popping like a string of firecrackers under the stress. She was inches away from the pilot, her gaze locked on the door handle. Another jolt hit the fuselage, throwing the entire cabin into a chaotic tilt. Jacqueline did not let go. She forced the latch, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She had to reach the pilot. She had to stabilize the descent. The door began to give, the metal frame warping under the immense pressure of the dive. She threw her weight one final time, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the cockpit beyond. The metal frame around the cockpit door screamed as the fuselage took the second blow. It was not turbulence. It was a rhythmic, bone-shaking impact that sent a tremor through the floorboards. The Dragon had returned. Its claws raked the outer skin of the plane, a sound like grinding steel that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. Then, the structural integrity failed. With a sound like a thunderclap, the windows on the port side imploded. The air was sucked out of the cabin in a blinding, instantaneous rush. Freezing winds, thin and razor-sharp, flooded the space, instantly turning the moisture in the air into a fog of ice crystals. The pressure differential hit them like a physical wall, knocking Jacqueline backward from the cockpit threshold. She tumbled, hitting the center aisle, her hands clawing at the floor to stay grounded. Every loose object became a projectile, swept toward the jagged, open gaps in the side of the plane. The temperature plunged, turning the interior into a vacuum of sub-zero air. Snow and debris swirled in a violent vortex. There was no sound now but the roar of the wind and the screech of torn metal. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a sieve, open to the lethal, thin atmosphere of the high mountain pass. The wind tore through the cabin, a relentless, howling torrent that turned every loose piece of debris into a lethal threat. Ruby was pinned against the side wall, her hair whipped into a frenzy by the pressure. She looked toward the cockpit, but there was nothing left to save. The front of the plane was gone. Elwyn lunged through the chaos, his boots skidding on the tilted, icy floor. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and hauled her toward the emergency hatch. He looked at her, his eyes hard and void of doubt, conveying the singular necessity of the moment. There was no room for hesitation. He jammed his shoulder into the hatch lever, but the mechanism had frozen solid in the sub-zero blast. He kicked it, his boot striking the metal with a dull, hollow thud. Again, he roared, putting his entire weight into the strike, and the lock finally gave way. The hatch groaned, bending outward, then snapped wide open. The roar of the wind intensified, a deafening shriek that threatened to tear them from the floor. He shoved her toward the opening, gesturing for her to jump as the plane pitched violently toward the jagged peaks. He did not look back at the wreckage. He only looked at the target, his gaze locked on the narrow, freezing gap of the open hatch. The plane nose-dived, the horizon spinning in a blur of rock and ice. Ruby clung to the hatch frame, her fingers numb, but Elwyn did not look at the sky. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the debris flying through the cabin, He slammed his palms directly onto the metal flooring. The vibration was instantaneous. A deep, resonant hum pulsed upward through the fuselage, defying the screaming wind. Beneath his hands, the metal began to glow with a dull, amber light. The air in the cabin shifted, thickening as he pulled at the earth beneath the mountain, weaving it into a lattice of solid, unyielding force. He gritted his teeth, veins standing out on his neck as he pushed the magic outward. A translucent, golden-hued barrier rippled across the floor, hardening into a dense layer of earth and stone that fused with the shivering frame of the jet. It was not just a shield, it was an anchor. He held his position, his weight locked into the floor, bracing for the inevitable collision with the ridge. The roar of the engines faded into a low, rhythmic thrumming of power. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, fueling the barrier until the very last second before the ground arrived. The impact happened in a heartbeat. The jet clipped the granite ridge with a sound like a mountain shattering. Elwyn's barrier flared, a blinding pulse of amber light that absorbed the primary kinetic shock, but the force was too great. The stone lattice groaned and fractured, spraying dust into the cabin. Metal screamed as it folded inward, the wings sheared off like dry wood against the rock. The fuselage groaned, a deep, structural shriek of tortured steel that drowned out the wind. One side of the plane peeled away, revealing the jagged mountain slope rushing past at terminal velocity. The floor beneath them buckled, snapping along the rivets. Debris surged upward, a storm of splintered metal and interior fixtures swirling through the cabin. The momentum shifted violently, throwing them sideways as the jet began to tear apart. The screech of tearing metal became a rhythmic, grinding roar as the fuselage rolled, grinding into the ridge. Gravity became a chaotic, shifting force, pulling them toward the opening gap. The cabin walls collapsed, the ceiling folded like paper, and the entire structure groaned one final time before it ripped into two distinct, jagged halves, scattering sparks and smoke into the freezing mountain air. The sky inverted. Gravity lost its grip as the fuselage disintegrated, throwing them into the freezing void. The wind was a physical weight, howling past ears and tearing at lungs. They tumbled, a chaotic tangle of limbs spinning through the thin mountain air. The ground rushed up, a jagged canvas of white and gray. Impact came with a bone-jarring thud. The snow was deep, yielding, and cold. It swallowed the momentum, packing tight against skin and filling every crevice. They slid down the incline, crashing into a drift that finally halted their descent. Silence followed the roar of the crash, punctuated only by the crackle of fire. A few yards away, the wreckage of the jet settled into the mountainside. The metal groaned as it cooled, twisting into useless shapes. Orange light flickered against the pristine white slope, casting long, dancing shadows. There was no movement in the snow for several heartbeats. The bitter cold bit into the skin, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the burning debris. Slowly, the air began to fill with the smell of scorched fuel and ozone. The mountain held them in its grip, indifferent and vast. While the remaining pieces of the plane continued to burn in the dark, Ruby blinked, the world spinning in shades of white and blinding orange. Her lungs burned with every inhalation of frigid air. She pressed her palms into the snow, feeling the ground vibrate with the dying groans of the wreckage. A few paces away, a section of the fuselage was engulfed in white-hot flames, the heat radiating outward and melting the surrounding drifts into slush. The fire was spreading, creeping toward the scattered luggage and the unconscious forms nearby. She pushed herself up, her knees sinking into the powder. Her hands shook, but she forced them to steady. She held her breath, centering the pressure in her chest. She raised her wrists, fingers splayed toward the inferno. The heat hit her face, a physical wall of resistance. She ignored it. With a sharp, rhythmic flick of her wrists, she drew a line through the air. The flames faltered. She pulled harder, twisting her movements to command the energy. The fire did not just die, it was pulled into her. The orange light collapsing into a single, glowing spark that vanished between her fingers. Silence reclaimed the clearing, save for the hiss of steam rising from the cooling metal. She stood, scanning the perimeter, the heat now entirely gone. Jacqueline stood, her boots crunching into the packed ice as she fought to regain her balance. The altitude made every breath a struggle, the air thin and biting against her throat. She ignored the ache in her limbs, turning her gaze upward to the jagged skyline. The wind whipped past, carrying the scent of ozone and something metallic. A low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to pulse through the air, vibrating in the soles of her feet. She did not blink. Her eyes tracked a dark shape moving against the pale, swirling clouds. The dragon was not fleeing. It was circling, banking wide to align itself for another pass. She shifted her weight, digging her heels into the drift, bracing for the inevitable strike. The beast moved with predatory grace, its wingspan blotting out the faint sun as it descended. Every muscle in her frame tightened, ready to spring. She watched the creature tighten its turn, the shimmering scales reflecting the harsh mountain light. There was no room for hesitation now. The horizon seemed to narrow, focusing entirely on the descent of the shadow. She stood motionless in the freezing gusts, her focus locked on the approaching wings, waiting for the exact moment the beast committed to the dive. The silence in the clearing was absolute, broken only by the settling of twisted metal. Ruby took a jagged step toward the front of the wreckage. The nose of the jet had been sheared away against the granite face of the ridge. She reached the mangled frame and peered into the cockpit. The controls were crushed, buried under a mountain of snow and shrapnel. There was no movement, no sound of breathing, just the smell of spilled fuel and the biting chill of the mountain. She turned back, meeting Elwyn's gaze. He stood by the wing, his hands hovering over the ice, his jaw set hard. He did not ask. He saw the truth in her eyes and lowered his head for a fraction of a second. Jacqueline remained apart, her back to them, her fingers digging into the snow as she forced herself to breathe. There was no time for eulogies or burial rites. The sky above was already turning, the threat still looming in the distance. Ruby looked at her teammates, her expression hardening into a mask of necessity. She nodded once, a sharp, singular movement. They turned away from the cockpit, leaving the pilot to the mountain. Survival was now the only objective left to them, and the wind was already beginning to howl again, covering their tracks in the deep, indifferent white. The sky shattered. The dragon did not merely descend, it collapsed the space between the clouds and the earth in a single, blurring motion. Gravity seemed to bend around the creature as it tucked its wings, turning into a projectile of shimmering copper and hate. A roar erupted from its throat, a sound so dense it vibrated the marrow in their bones. Ruby felt the pressure wave hit her first, a wall of displaced air that forced her to stagger back. She dropped to one knee, her hands clawing at the frozen crust of the mountain to hold her position. The beast was gaining speed, the air whistling through its scales, turning into a high-pitched scream. Jacqueline squinted against the stinging ice shards kicked up by the downdraft. She watched the creature aim not for the center of the group, but for the open space between them, calculating the trajectory with predatory precision. Talons, each as long as a sword, unfurled from the dragon's underside, shredding the very air they passed through. The light of the sun caught the sharpened tips, glinting like butcher knives. Every second dragged, stretching the distance between the predator and the ground into an eternity. The beast was locked on target, its eyes fixed, its momentum absolute, and the distance closed to a mere heartbeat away. Elwyn moved before the shadow fully touched them. He threw his palms against the frozen earth, his fingers digging into the permafrost. The ground groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that drowned out the dragon's screech. From the soil, jagged slabs of granite erupted with impossible speed, spiraling upward and inward to interlock into a massive, concave wall. He poured his focus into the stone, his veins throbbing, his stance widening to anchor the structure against the coming weight. A fraction of a second later, the impact arrived. The dragon slammed into the barrier with the force of a falling star. The shockwave turned the snow around them into a blinding mist. The stone wall buckled, deep cracks spiderwebbing across its face, but it held. Dust and grit rained down from the ceiling of the shield, coating their hair and skin. Every muscle in Elwyn's body locked, his teeth gritted, as he fought to keep the barrier from shattering under the relentless, rhythmic hammering of talons. The dragon pulled back, circling, its claws raking against the stone with a sound like grinding metal. The world outside the wall was a blur of copper and fire, but inside, the air was still thick with the scent of crushed rock and the shallow, ragged breathing of the survivors. The barrier shuddered as the dragon raked its claws across the top, sending a cascade of stone debris falling onto the team. Jacqueline didn't wait for the shield to fail. She saw the dragon pivot, its massive wing exposing a vulnerable gap near the shoulder. She kicked off the base of the granite wall, her boots finding purchase in the loose, icy scree. Her lungs burned with the cold, but she forced the air into her chest, hardening her resolve. She channeled every ounce of her training into her palms, feeling the familiar hum of energy vibrating through her muscles. She sprinted toward the beast, crossing the exposed snowfield in a blur of motion. She ignored the freezing wind biting at her skin. Her focus narrowed to a singular point on the copper scales. She leaped, her body a coiled spring, and thrust both hands forward. A surge of raw, kinetic force erupted from her fingertips, a focused beam of power aimed squarely at the dragon. The air around her fists distorted, rippling with the intensity of the strike. She was a projectile in flight, closing the distance with lethal intent, leaving the safety of the stone behind to meet the predator head-on. The strike hit with the sound of a thunderclap. Jacqueline's energy slammed into the copper scales, forcing the beast to buckle in midair. It let out a piercing, jagged screech that echoed off the mountain walls, vibrating through the very ice beneath their feet. The dragon thrashed, its massive wings beating frantically against the thin air. But the trajectory was ruined. It spiraled downward for a heartbeat, tail lashing out and carving a deep trench into the snow before it managed to level off. The shimmer of its copper hide dulled, the light flickering as if the creature were struggling to maintain its form. It banked hard, turning away from the ridge, its movements no longer precise or predatory. It climbed rapidly, putting distance between itself and the ground. The team watched in silence as the beast grew smaller, a fading spark against the overcast sky. It did not look back. It simply vanished into the low, heavy clouds, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and the ringing in their ears. The sudden absence of the threat left a void in the atmosphere. The mountain returned to its natural state, save for the deep, scorched gashes left in the snow where the talons had struck only moments before. The predator was gone, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the fight itself. Ruby stood motionless, her gaze sweeping over the charred remains of the fuselage. The metal groaned as it cooled, popping and settling into the snow. She looked toward Elwyn, who was leaning heavily against a jagged outcrop, his breathing labored. Jacqueline stood a few paces away, her hands still trembling from the energy discharge. There was no relief in the silence. The treaty was a memory, burned away along with the fuselage. Ruby scanned the horizon, expecting the return of the shadow, fully aware that their secrecy was gone. They were no longer hidden protectors, living in the margins. They were now the primary targets in a war that had just spilled into the open. She saw the shift in her teammates. Elwyn wiped soot from his face, his eyes hardening as he scanned the perimeter. Jacqueline tightened her grip on her equipment, her posture abandoning the hesitation of an athlete for the readiness of a soldier. The mountain pass felt exposed, a trap waiting to be sprung. Ruby stepped forward, her boots crunching through the crust of the snow. She met their eyes one by one, acknowledging the new reality without a word. The sanctuary of their old lives had ended at this ridge. Every step they took from here would be under the gaze of the enemy. Ruby turned her back on the cooling metal and began the descent. The city was miles away, a distant sprawl of lights, barely visible through the mountain mist. Elwyn followed, his movements stiff from the exertion of the barrier, but he kept his eyes on the path ahead. Jacqueline took the lead, her pace brisk and unwavering. The terrain was unforgiving. Ice-crusted rocks shifted under their weight, and the wind bit into any exposed skin. When they reached a sheer, frozen incline that blocked their progress, the group did not stop. Elwyn slammed his palms into the mountainside, shifting the earth to create a series of stable footholds. They climbed in silence, the rhythm of their breathing syncing with the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Every movement was calculated to conserve energy. They did not speak of the dragon or the treaty. Their focus remained entirely on the horizon. The landscape shifted from jagged peaks to rolling foothills, and with every mile, their stride grew more uniform. They moved as a single unit, a deliberate force cutting through the desolate landscape. The city lights grew brighter, no longer a goal, but a destination they were rapidly closing in on. The exhaustion was present, but it was secondary to the steady rhythmic pulse of their advance. The wilderness gave way to the harsh geometry of the city outskirts. Concrete replaced stone, and the distant hum of traffic grew into a constant, low-frequency roar. Ruby led them through the narrow alleyways, keeping to the shadows where the light could not catch the grime on their faces or the ash clinging to their skin. Every passerby was a potential threat, every glance a reason to pull lower into their own shoulders. They moved with a jagged, uneven rhythm, forced to navigate around locked gates and debris-filled shortcuts that slowed their progress to a painful crawl. Elwyn stumbled once, his hand brushing a brick wall, but he caught himself before his weight dragged them down. They pushed onward, lungs burning, heart rate spiking with every block they cleared. The stadium loomed ahead, a massive structure of steel and glass, vibrating with the collective energy of thousands. They reached the perimeter gates just as a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the ambient noise of the crowd. The final whistle. It echoed across the parking lot, a signal that their window of opportunity was closing. They did not slow down. They converged on the entrance, three figures marked by the struggle of the mountain, arriving at the threshold of the stadium just as the doors began to groan under the pressure of the exiting audience. The stadium gates gave way with a metallic groan. They stepped out of the cold night and into the overwhelming heat of the arena. Thousands of voices collided in a singular, deafening roar that vibrated through the concrete floor. Ruby and Elwyn flanked her, their presence a silent wall. Jacqueline moved forward, ignoring the stares of the staff and the confused murmurs of the nearby players. She did not stop for the injured, nor did she acknowledge the officials rushing toward them. She walked straight onto the polished surface of the court. The stadium lights hit her, exposing the soot and the jagged marks of the crash, but she did not flinch. She stopped at the center circle. The crowd noise hit a frantic pitch, a wall of sound that seemed to press inward. She did not look at the scoreboard, nor did she acknowledge the game that had just concluded. She stood perfectly still, a singular figure in the center of the chaos. Her posture was rigid, her jaw set, and her eyes scanned the perimeter of the arena. Every movement she made was precise, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The transition from the mountain wreckage to this public stage was absolute. She was no longer a participant in a game. She was the center of a shift in the world. She inhaled, the air thick with the scent of sweat and polished wood, and held her ground as the arena watched. The scoreboard flashed the final tally, but the numbers were meaningless. Jacqueline did not turn her head to check the result. She remained in the center of the court, her body vibrating with the residual hum of the arena. The roar of the crowd began to lose its focus, shifting from cheers into a low, confused murmur as the audience noticed her detachment. She ignored the officials signaling for her to leave. She ignored the teammates calling her name from the sidelines. Her world had narrowed to the rectangular patch of night sky visible through the stadium roof. A cold draft drifted down, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone. She squinted, her eyes tracing the darkness where the stars were obscured by clouds. There, in the periphery of her vision, a shadow flickered. It was not a bird, and it was not a plane. It moved with a jagged, predatory grace that defied the wind. She tightened her grip, her fingers curling into fists. The peace treaty was a ghost, and the threat was no longer miles away. It was circling back to finish the hunt. She stood motionless, a sentinel in the center of the court, waiting for the inevitable descent. The sky was no longer a canopy, it was a countdown.